The New Orleans Saints must answer their biggest question at quarterback this week at the NFL Scouting Combine. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, the New Orleans Saints' newest defensive coaching staff hires a big one and shows some growth for defensive coordinator Brandon Staley. The New Orleans Saints must have a clear plan in terms of what to do with their aging veterans. And we're going to lead today's show off with the biggest question that we're hoping the New Orleans Saints answer this week at the NFL Scouting Combine, the big question around quarterback and specifically Derek Carr's future with the team. We got all that and more for you on today's episode. We appreciate you very much, whether it's your first time or your next time, for being with us this time, making us your first listen and being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The clock continues to tick for the New Orleans Saints, who must answer their glaring, looming quarterback question around Derek Carr this week. It's a huge week for the NFL, and it's a huge week for the New Orleans Saints. Not only is the NFL Scouting Combine an opportunity for these draft prospects to show up and be able to put their names on the map if they need to, or potentially move their names up the rankings when it comes to their workouts, drills, interviews, things like that, but all the newsbreakers and all the decision makers are all in one place for almost an entire week, which means information is going to come out about some of the biggest question marks around each NFL team. And the biggest question mark staring the New Orleans Saints in the face is their future at the most important position in football, quarterback. And this week should be the time, must be the time, needs to be the time in which the New Orleans Saints dedicate and have an idea of what a clear vision, clear path forward will be at the position. Why this week? Because this gives you an opportunity, first of all, if you make the decision to stick with Derek Carr, to be able to kind of get a contract restructure done, all these other things, kind of get all that stuff planned out, figure out what's going on in free agency, where do you want to go, where can you go? You hear a lot of whispers over the course of this NFL Scouting Combine week about who's going to become available, the cap casualties, all those other things. You can begin to kind of sort of plan for how to utilize that money, because restructuring Derek Carr does not tie you to him in 2026. I want to be very, very clear about that, but it does open up $30 million worth of salary cap space, assuming they did a full restructure. They don't have to. They could do a partial restructure, but assuming they did a full restructure, there would be a lot of opportunity to add talent to this team with those funds. But it does not, despite what everybody outside of New Orleans seems to want to believe, actually tie you to him for his future for a couple of years, I think was something that I even saw like one article, right? That they restructure him, they're tied to him for a couple of years, at least a couple of years. It's like, no, none of that is true. That's not how these numbers work at all. But if the Saints also make the decision to move on from him, then trading him might be a big path forward for the team. That would save them over $11 million. He would have to waive his no trade clause. But again, the decision makers are all in Indianapolis this week. So it's an opportunity to bump elbows, talk shop, all this other stuff with the people that you're going to be making those deals alongside. So that becomes, in this conference, if you will, or kind of convention feel environment, becomes an opportunity for you to further those conversations if that is the route that you want to go. And then beyond that, your opportunity to potentially move off of him as a post-June 1 cut, save yourself $30 million that you won't realize until June 2nd, but ends up making him an early free agent, gives him the opportunity to go out there and potentially sign with a new team. Well, this is an opportunity to start kind of shopping that idea. And of course, also trying to figure out what's going on at quarterback around the rest of the league. Will Justin Fields hit the market? And is that somebody in which you have interest? What is going to happen with some of these younger quarterbacks in this year's draft that aren't the top guys, that are looking to stand out, further their their opportunities in the NFL, raise their stock in the NFL draft. What does that actually end up looking like? This entire week gives you the opportunity to at least further your context and deepen your understanding as an NFL franchise of what it is that you're going to do at that position and what your next steps are going to be afterwards. The other thing to remember is that come March 14th, $30 million of Derek Carr's base salary becomes guaranteed, fully guaranteed. And in that case, you have to have between now and then some kind of plan for how you intend, at least, to move forward with that deal, with Derek Carr, with Spencer Rattler, with this draft class, with this free agency class, with that money, with that contract, wherever it might be. And the time is ticking, right? The gap between now and then is narrowing. So this becomes a really important week for the New Orleans Saints, and it becomes a really important week for New Orleans Saints fans as well, because not only, I don't think the Saints are making that decision this week, but I think that they're in a situation to where any decisions that they've already made or any decisions that they're about to arrive to are going to quickly become public over the course of this week. And so being able to, again, further your context and better understand what your next steps are after you make your decisions and after your mind is made up about where you want to go at quarterback, that's the context that you're filling in over the course of this week. So I would expect at some point in the next 5 or 6 days for there to be some news around what the New Orleans Saints intend to do at quarterback, which could be to stick with Derek Carr for 2025. It could be to trade him. It could be to designate him as a post-June 1 cut. And in either of those two situations, who's the quarterback that they turn to? Do they go to the young Spencer Rattler, or are they interested in free agency, or are they interested in the draft? I think competition's always good for young quarterbacks, so I really think it's a combination of some of these events more than it is just one of those options. But I do think that this is the week where you finally start to hear a little bit more about what the New Orleans Saints plans are going to be at that position. When we met and spoke with Kellen Moore during his introductory press conference, and we will meet and speak with him again this week. When we met and spoke with him during his introductory press conference, he was non-committal around Derek Carr. He wasn't giving no commitment to Derek Carr. He was simply not making a commitment or going one way or another in that moment. It felt like a very authentic and genuine, I don't really know yet. Well, now you don't have that, right? It's not I just showed up here yesterday. I haven't really gotten an opportunity to meet the guys. Been in the building now for a little over a month, or almost a month, let's say it that way, a few weeks. And so at this point, whatever it is that was needed to be learned should have been learned by now. And so the Saints should absolutely be ready to start to figure out and start to make the moves necessary that indicate what it is that they're going to do at the quarterback position, or fully indicate what it is that they intend to do at the quarterback position over the course of this week. So big week on the way for one of the biggest question marks around the New Orleans Saints, and even more questions are on the way around the aging veterans. What's next for guys like Cam Jordan, Demario Davis, Tyrann Mathieu? We'll discuss that next, and I'll tell you why I think we're going to get a lot of information on that this upcoming week. We got all that coming up for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, family, the New Orleans Saints must have a clear path ready for their aging veterans on their roster, in particular those over on the defensive side, the names that always come up and the names whose futures are always in question over the course of this offseason so far have been defensive end Cameron Jordan, linebacker Demario Davis, and safety Tyrann Mathieu. And I think this week is where you start to kind of pick up a little bit more information about what their future is going to look like in New Orleans. And I promise you, my reasoning isn't just because, it's the NFL scouting combine and people talk to one another. No, but the real reason here is that one of the other big question marks that we expect to be answered over the course of this week is going to be around what the defensive scheme looks like. Will they actually change? Will they actually go to a 3-4 defensive scheme? Or is that something they're going to do over the course of 2025 and 2026? And if they make the shift over to a 3-4 completely here in 2025, which of these veteran guys that has money attached to them, that doesn't really save you money to move on from by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly gives you opportunities, mechanisms, things like that to save some money if you wanted to. You'd have to go about reworking contracts or designating post-June 1, all these other things. But if you're making the complete shift to 3-4, do they fit? You have to be able to answer that question. If you're not able to say that they do fit, then that gives you a pretty good indication of what their future is, not just here in 2025, but beyond. And it might not be here in New Orleans. And so that's why I think this week we're going to get some big answers, even if not directly, around the future of some of these veteran guys. The New Orleans Saints right now have 8 players over the age of 30 on their roster, and that's not including 31-year-old Lucas Patrick, who's a pending free agent. So you've got 9 guys effectively coming off of last year's roster. We know, or we believe, that 30-year-old Ryan Ramczyk is soon to retire. It certainly seems like that's been set up, dealing with that degenerative knee issue that really came to a head in 2023. He lost his entire 2024 season because of it, took the salary reduction all the way down to base salary earlier this offseason, saved the team $16 million more, $16 million plus. But that's typically a precursor for a retirement. So you can see you have a pretty clear answer there when it comes to Ryan Ramczyk, though it will be interesting to learn if they are indeed going to make that move, which it certainly does look like it. It'd be shocking if they weren't. And so then the rest of it that you're looking at is all of these other veterans, and those 3 guys over on the defensive side end up always kind of highlighting the conversation. But what happens with Taysom Hill at 34 years old, coming off of another massive knee injury? Is he really going to be back ready to play football? And is he going to be back in time for the season to begin? We'll probably get some updates in terms of his progress there. Remember, it was during the combine last year that we learned that Ryan Ramczyk's progress at one point was looking pretty good, and then all of a sudden wasn't anymore, right? Remember that kind of the snip, snap, sip, snap of that all? I assume we'll probably get some updates on where Taysom Hill is over the course of this week. So clear plans are needed when it comes to these veteran players. Does Cam Jordan fit in your 3-4 system? Probably be a 3-4 defensive end. I don't know if he's going to enjoy that role very much as not being a pass rusher, but being more of a dedicated run stopper while you have the pass rushers on the outside. But certainly can fit that role. Demario Davis certainly fits that role for you because of his ability to cover and get downhill and play the run game, the versatility there. But what does that mean for a guy like Tyrann Mathieu, who dealt with a lot of injury last season? And, to his own dismay, as he spoke with Brooke Kirchhoffer over on her YouTube channel, talking about how he wasn't even able to finish the last game of the season and how much that frustrated him. He wants to play 2 more years in New Orleans. He wants to bring a ring back to New Orleans and bring the Lombardi back to the city. But is he going to have the time to get that done before the system, before the coaches, before the fit dictates his future, right? If he has an opportunity to dictate his future, then fine. But that might not be the case. That decision might be made elsewhere and away from him. So that's what I would be looking for when it comes to these veteran players for the New Orleans Saints, and why this week is so important. There's also the kind of, I'll call it less than fortunate stuff that happens during the combine, and then teams get an opportunity to see what the future at certain positions look like, and then they look back at what they have, and then sometimes grass feels greener on the other side. And then so all of a sudden that starts to change a little bit about how they feel about what they have in lieu of what they could have and what they're seeing and all these other things. There's all these other kinds of dealings that happen all throughout the scouting combine that don't have anything to do with the players themselves that are really in consideration. It has everything to do with the players that could replace them and what that looks like and how intriguing that is, how exciting that might be for a coach, for a general manager, for a scouting team, for a college scout personnel director, all these other things that all of a sudden influences what they feel about the guy that's already in the building. And so this is a week of a lot of compound stuff that happens with the player, away from the player, with the organization, away from the organization, that kind of dictates what futures will look like. So I think this week we'll get some more of those big kind of thoughts, right? What's the future of Cam Jordan? What's the future of Demario Davis? What's the future of Tyrann Mathieu? If I had to put a little bit of money down on each one of those, I'd probably put the most down on Demario Davis, because Demario Davis has probably seen the lesser impact of age. Cam Jordan's sack production has been down. His snap percentage has been moved down, all these other things. Some of that is team decision. Some of that is physical ability, dealing with injury, things like that. Tyrann Mathieu has been more impacted by injury than Demario Davis has. So if I had to put more money on one of those 3, I'm probably putting more money on Demario Davis to carry over and still be a part of this scheme. But that doesn't mean that all three of them won't. It doesn't mean that all three of them will, for that matter. So it's going to be really interesting to kind of see where things move for the New Orleans Saints when it comes to those three players. And I think that we'll learn more about that over the course of this week. The other reason why I think that we'll learn about that over the course of this week goes back to the time ticking thing that we talked about with Derek Carr. You got to start making decisions at some point, who you're going to restructure, who you're going to approach for pay cuts, pay reductions, reworks, who you're going to extend if there's somebody that you can extend and save money, all these other things. That's probably not going, the extension part isn't a part of the 34-year-old player conversation, but it could be a part of the younger player conversations and things like that to save, $1 million, $2 million here, there, wherever. But you're getting closer and closer to where you have to have made those decisions in order to be under the salary cap. I mean, you have to be not only compliant with the salary cap, but ideally you're opening up money for yourself to spend as well. And so now that you're looking at this a little bit less than, or almost 2 weeks, just a touch more than 2 weeks away from the new league year beginning on March 12th, with February being a short month, those decisions have to start being made, and some of that work has to start being done. You look back to last year, I think it was last year. No, it was the year before last, to where they had extended Eric McCoy. That happened on a February 22nd date. And now here we are, February 25th. Not a lot has been done yet. So this is kind of the other reason that I feel like we're going to get some pretty clear indications of what's going to happen with this New Orleans Saints team, with these aging veterans, because if nothing else, leave out the scouting combine. Leave out the shift in defensive scheme, potential shift in defensive scheme. We'll learn more about that this week. Leave out the seeing what you could have versus what you do have. Leave out all that kind of stuff. If nothing else, every second is a second less. And so you got to start making decisions very quickly on what you plan to do with these players. Coming up next, the New Orleans Saints' most recent defensive staff addition is a big one, and it shows some growth for defensive coordinator Brandon Staley. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints defensive coaching staff addition of Terry Joseph is a big one. And to me, it shows you some things that feel promising about Brandon Staley and where he is after being a successful defensive coordinator for a year with the Rams and then struggling as the head coach of the Los Angeles Chargers. Now he comes back as a defensive coordinator again, but this time with the New Orleans Saints. And I think this hire shows you a little bit of self-awareness in terms of where he is, where he could use some help, and how he's going to build out his coaching staff. I think this is a big move. So the New Orleans Saints hired Terry Joseph, former Texas Longhorns defensive passing game coordinator and secondary coach, former Archbishop Shaw grad, also worked with them, as well as the other high schools in the area before becoming a longtime collegiate coaching assistant, a New Orleans native. He returns to New Orleans as the Saints defensive passing game coordinator. I believe the first time they've ever actually filled that position. I went back through the annuals of coaching, staff, coaching staffs and all that for the Saints year after year after year after year. And I'm sure that they have had guys that have served that role. You think back to during the 2021 season where it was co-defensive coordinator under Dennis Allen. Was that 2021 or was that 22? I think that was 22. Sorry, 2022. Chris Richard as well as Ryan Nielsen were kind of the co-defensive coordinators. And the assumption was always that, okay, so really Chris Richard is like a defensive passing game coordinator, defensive backs coach, while Ryan Nielsen is a defensive line coach / defensive run game coordinator. And so they had focuses in the run game, focuses in the passing game. We saw the same thing with Joe Woods and Marcus Robertson last year, along with Todd Grantham and Michael Hodges last year when Darren Rizzi took over and effectively demoted Todd Grantham and all those other pieces. So you can kind of see that they've always had some semblance of the position, right? Somebody that was focused on helping with the run game and on defense, helping defend the pass game, all those other things. But I think this is the first time I've ever had like a straight up defensive passing game coordinator on the roster here, or on the coaching staff roster. And Terry Joseph is somebody that draws a lot of respect from along the collegiate sort of ranks. And the Saints wanted somebody from college. One of their top defensive coordinator candidates was a collegiate DC. And so now you get into this situation, or so I've heard. And so now you get into this position to where, okay, you hired Brandon Staley, but then now So you didn't get the collegiate guy. How do you get the collegiate experience that you're looking for? Well, you bring in this guy to be your defensive passing game coordinator. So a huge opportunity for Terry Joseph, cousin of Vance Joseph, by the way, also New Orleans native, to be able to come back home and contribute to the New Orleans Saints in a big way. And I think that this does two things. First of which is the most important thing and the most immediate thing, which is that I think it shows growth from Brandon Staley. Brandon Staley, of course, had these types of positions for his team when he was with the Chargers. It's a common thing that you see around the NFL now. But I do think that that being his first hire, as opposed to the position coaching positions being his first hires, I think it shows you what he was prioritizing. And he's prioritizing that he wants someone to come in and specialize in defending the pass while he focuses on his scheme, his fronts, all these other things, and maybe even focuses on the run game maybe a little bit more. And so I think what it shows you is that maybe Brandon Staley feels, okay, I could use some more help in the secondary than just a defensive than as a defensive coordinator, than just a defensive backs coach. I want somebody in the room with me that's seeing the game a little bit differently, that is seeing what young players are doing in college and how collegiate things are moving from college game plans into the NFL. How do we prepare for those? How do we defend those? This is a guy in Terry Joseph who has very recent experience doing exactly that. Spent 2021 through 2024 with the Texas Longhorns. And before that was with A&M. At one point, he was with LSU, like he's been, or is at Destrehan High School for a little bit, like he has coached now at every level, because this New Orleans Saints job will be his first pro job. So I like the fact that it's kind of Brandon Staley saying, okay, what don't I have? I don't have knowledge of what's going on in today's collegiate game for these young guys that are coming in and taking over the NFL. The NFL is creeping closer and closer to the college game. I don't have that experience. Let me go and get somebody that does, right? I don't have that recent experience, that recent knowledge. Let me go and get somebody else who's experienced that very, very recently. The other thing that I think that it shows you in terms of growth is maybe he's acknowledging that one of the big issues that he had when he was with the Chargers was getting a passing defense to really stand up against the test, especially in that division in the AFC West. And so now he goes and gets a guy that can help him do exactly that. The way that I like to think about it, and I used to think about it this way all the time when I was working as a stage manager, when I was working in theater, is like a good toolbox doesn't have the same tool over and over and over again, right? You don't have a big toolbox that you bring to a big construction site job that has 50 Phillips head screwdrivers in it, right? You don't just have a bunch of things that are the exact same. You have a Phillips head screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver, you have a hex, you have different multi-tools, you've got wrenches, speed wrenches, crescent wrenches, all these other things, right? You have all of this stuff so that a hammer, right? You have all of these things so that you have the appropriate tool for the job. The thing that makes a toolbox effective, or makes an effective toolbox effective, is having a bunch of different things that can achieve a bunch of different things. So when you're building a team, as a manager, as a defensive coordinator, as a head coach, go and get the guys that are good at the things that you're not good at, that have the knowledge that you don't have. And that takes a self-awareness. That takes a self-awareness that says, what don't I have? Where could I use help? Where do I need additional perspective, maybe not even perspective, but it might be, innovations. It might be experience. It might be whatever, right? Just a knowledge base that's different than yours. And I think that this hire of Terry Joseph shows that a little bit, if nothing else, indicates that for Brandon Staley. So I applaud that. I also think it's a great hire. And it's a good thing to have one of those younger guys with a lot of that collegiate experience on your staff. I do agree with that approach. The second thing that I think that it does is that it gives you a little bit of an inside track to knowledge around some of these Texas Longhorns in this draft. And there are many of them, right? You look at Jahdae Barron, who he's one of the top corners, top defensive backs in this year's draft, along with Michigan's Will Johnson. He took to social media and all he tweeted, all he said in his posts was, something along the lines of, "This man changed my life." It's a pretty good cosign. I think that it shows you, first of all, what kind of person you're getting in a Terry Joseph that can have that kind of an impact on a young player. But it also shows you, okay, well, there's a little bit of a connection here to Jahdae Brown, one of the best defensive players in this year's draft. Okay, cool. Good to hold on to. But also, he's going to have some experience with guys like Alfred Collins, the big defensive tackle out of Texas. He's going to have some experience against some of these wide receivers like Isaiah Bond and Mathieu Golden. He's going to have experience against some of these offensive linemen that are going to be, Kelvin Banks and Cameron Thomas, I think is the other. Like, you have now all of a sudden this inside track to at least some knowledge of these younger Texas Longhorns players that are coming out of this year's draft and that have come out over the course of the past few years. So that's another thing. I think that's a little bit less immediate than the Brandon Staley part of it all. But I do think that bottom line, Terry Joseph, fantastic hire for the New Orleans Saints over on the defensive side. This week, I'm sure we'll continue to see more and more of that defensive staff filled out because, again, the decision makers and the folks looking for jobs are all going to be in one place for the next about week. So I would expect to see some movement when it comes to all of that. All right, y'all, coming up in tomorrow's episode, any updates that we have from the Combine, as well as players to watch as workouts begin. We'll dive into all that in tomorrow's episode. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. If you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jaxson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.